Something odd seems to be happening with Splatoon. What does it mean for Splatoon's imminent future, and are we looking at signs of some kind of behind-the-scenes pivot with Nintendo's strategy for this series over the last couple of years? So firstly, to see what we're talking about, let's wind back to the 16th of September 2024. Nintendo made a confirmation that seemed to mark the beginning of the end of Splatoon 3's time in the sun after 3 years of regular updates. They said, after 2 incredible years of Splatoon 3, regular updates will come to a close. Don't worry, Splatoween, Frosty Fest, Springfest, and Summer Nights will continue with some returning themes. The Japanese version of this was a little bit more specific, but broadly conveyed the same message. They said the regular content additions to Splatoon 3, which were announced to continue for 2 years after launch, will come to an end, but Splatoween, Frosty Fest, Springfest, and Summer Nights will continue to be held in the future, with some additional challenges being brought back. Additionally, update data, including weapon performance changes and such, is planned to be delivered irregularly. Now, all things considered, it strongly appeared like Nintendo were closing the door on Splatoon 3, and this tracks with the way they wound down Splatoon 2 in 2019 to start focusing on the sequel game. However, the version 10 and now version 11 updates to Splatoon 3 were more than tinkering with weapons and performance. They introduced 30 new weapon kits in June 2025, and in January 2026, as well as weapon rebalancing, they introduced some completely new mechanics, including some fairly major innovations, including the new concept of flow aura and a new health bar of sorts. Splatoon fan Jazz, who brought this to my attention in the first place, said, "The community is extremely excited as the game plays better than it ever has, but of course, the change in Nintendo's plans are baffling. The weapons added in 10.0 are set in such a way that it seems clear that there will be many more like them. There are obviously missing versions of the new types for certain weapon classes, and so these seem inevitable. Also, with the 11.0 update, Nintendo in the patch notes mentioned future patches, so in multiple ways the game is very much alive and appears like it will be for a while. Feels like something drastically impacted Nintendo's plans." And that does track. Why announce final updates in September 2024 only to release such large and significant updates in June 2025 and January 2026 unless there was a change of plans? So firstly, let's look back to the end of Splatoon 2. That game entered version 5, its final form, on the 31st of July 2019, and this made sense if you consider where the team was at that point. The developers, EPD Group 5, were 8 months out from the release of Animal Crossing New Horizons, which realistically was probably entering the testing phase by that point, so it made sense for the working group to pivot to their next project. The core Splatoon staff were always working on Splatoon, of course, but the team who had been focusing on art, music, and assets for Animal Crossing New Horizon were able to come home to Splatoon 3. Actually, as I deep dived in the credits a while ago, there were a significant number of new people on the team, and it seems inevitable that eventually such major franchises as Splatoon and Animal Crossing will develop their own separate continual development groups who are not reliant on each other's staff to do assets and such like, but that's another matter. In September 2024, there was no imminent new title planned as far as we know, but it does seem likely that something Splatoon entered development at this point. The following June, Nintendo announced Splatoon Raiders, but it also seems inevitably the case that Nintendo will want to get a full Splatoon 4 onto Switch 2 sooner or later. So let's look at what could have happened over this time. Intrinsically, this is going to be speculative, but hopefully by running down several potential scenarios, we can weigh up which feels more plausible. Option 1. The plan remained the same, but the communication was just a bit off. Occam's razor says that this is just what they planned all along, and therefore the communication in September 2024 was perhaps a bit misinterpreted. Nintendo like to set expectations clearly and hate over-promising, so by making clear that they're ending Splatoon 3 development while having a few people work on it still, they had the option to surprise on the upside, but didn't necessarily expect to. It's also the case that we've seen a couple of miscommunications from Nintendo's PR in recent times, including the leak of a promotion for the Nintendo Switch Online, which featured Metroid Prime 2 and Pikmin 2, and which was hurriedly apologized for. This is different as it's from the official Japanese Splatoon 3 account, and so presumably they're far more closely intertwined with the development group. They've also had many months to correct it, and it's not an insignificant mistake. With the Pikmin 2 alleged reveal, they rushed to correct it, I suspect, because it had the real chance of denting sales of Pikmin 2. Now, sure, there might not be masses of people who are jumping on board that game and who would also be aware of the rumours, but since the digital title at this point is basically pure profit for Nintendo, and they might not be intending to put Pikmin 2 onto Nintendo Switch Online for many years, or potentially ever, that mistake would have potentially been quite costly for Nintendo over the long term. The Splatoon announcement is potentially even more sensitive, as it might give the impression that Splatoon 3 won't be worth buying because a sequel game will be along in due course, which might damage the uptake of one of Nintendo's more reliable evergreens. Therefore, on balance, I think they genuinely did intend to shut Splatoon 3's doors for major updates in 2024. Now, I'm cautious about saying this because it is generally a good rule of thumb that less complicated interpretations tend to be closer to the truth. Still, if this option is to be ruled out, we need to consider option 2. They got the collar tug by Nintendo's head office to add more content after the end of 2024. It's obviously a big priority for Nintendo currently to majorly support their big evergreens in order to gently encourage Switch players to upgrade and to keep alive the massive player base on the Nintendo Switch that is not yet ready for the Switch 2. Indeed, Shuntaro Furukawa made the exact point in the February 2026 Investor Q&A, saying, "We believe it is very important to maintain touchpoints with consumers who are active on our gaming systems as the transition from Nintendo Switch to Nintendo Switch 2 unfolds over the next few years." In that sense, by releasing updates for Animal Crossing New Horizons and Splatoon 3, which both saw high sales volume on Nintendo Switch, we hope to create a flow where, as consumers continue to play on Nintendo Switch, they will transition to Switch 2 when new titles that catch their attention are released. From this perspective, it is meaningful to release updates for Nintendo Switch software, which has a large install base, to maintain user activity and encourage continued play." End quote. However, I think Splatoon also fitted a particular priority profile. They tested the waters with Nintendo Switch 2 editions with the Zeldas, Jamboree, and Forgotten Land, but since then we've seen Animal Crossing New Horizons and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, both huge titles with a particular focus on multiplayer content in their expansions. Splatoon 3 also fits this profile well. Notably, though, it doesn't support game share, something that the expansions of Super Mario Party Jamboree, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and many of the free upgrades like Captain Toad and Super Mario Odyssey do prioritize. Now, even if streaming to game share were technically possible, given the frenetic pace of Splatoon matches, I don't think Nintendo is ready to give up on the financial rewards of every Splatoon player using their own console to play. Still, without being able to offer game share, a free update for Splatoon 3 would just look like a mild graphical polish, and this might have led to some internal debate about whether Nintendo are maximizing their use of such a valuable game. If Nintendo's leadership asked the team in early 2025 to develop something more substantial for the Nintendo Switch 2 to keep players engaged, it would explain why new updates emerged despite prior communications. Option 3 then. There was originally a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of the game that did not transpire, and versions 10 and 11 of Splatoon 3 are the remnants of that original plan. Given the importance of the Splatoon series to Nintendo, a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Splatoon 3 would be an obvious move in many ways, but instead, free Nintendo Switch 2 updates were released. What would warrant this approach? Well, for one thing, in a multiplayer game like Splatoon, it's very difficult to split up your audience between two player bases. You need everybody to be able to access the vast majority of features, so the only real way you could bring people over would be a completely new mode. Is there any evidence that a new mode was ever being piloted? Well, one theory we could point to: Splatoon Raiders. Nintendo has quite a history of DLC becoming discrete games, including, most recently, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Consider also the rather unusual announcement of Raiders, not in the April Direct, but a few months later. This could be just a part of Nintendo pacing out their announcements, but it also seems possible to me that they decided to pivot from having a Splatoon 3 Nintendo Switch 2 edition plus Splatoon Raiders announced in their big Switch 2 Direct, and instead had the team split the update into two, whereby the patches and regular upgrades would release over a period of time, and then the Raiders game would release as its own full title later on. Another point indicating some kind of change is the lack of a September 2025 title, I suspect. It is incredibly unusual for Nintendo to skip September, especially since all they had in August was the downloadable Dragon Drive and the Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Now, I think there's strong evidence that the title meant for this slot was not Splatoon, but Metroid Prime 4. With Federation Force, Samus Returns, and Metroid Dread, there's a history of Metroid occupying the 6-week window from the last week of August to the first week of October, and September would fit squarely with this expectation, while giving the game a great push before the holiday. It also fits as this was one of the games shown at the Nintendo Switch 2 events alongside Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza, and so might be assumed to be targeting a window close to launch. However, Nintendo also rarely avoids the December slot entirely. It's true that some years they have skipped December, but even if it's a smaller title like Fitness Boxing or Big Brain Academy, and often in the earlier part of the Switch one's life it was big titles like Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, there is usually some kind of December drop, and a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of a major game might fit that profile perfectly. On balance, I'd have thought that Animal Crossing New Horizon would be the more marketable game pre-Christmas, given its greater reach into the Western market and higher profile generally, whereas Splatoon 3 might have been the ideal title to anchor January. Animal Crossing's update was great and welcome, but let's face it, relatively small, whereas a whole new game mode on Splatoon 3 would have been a stronger start to the year for Switch 2. If we follow the logic of this theory through, the decision to spin Splatoon Raiders off would have happened quite some time ago, probably early 2025. Nintendo wouldn't have had another January game in the pipeline, but with Metroid Prime 4's delay, they were able to move Animal Crossing New Horizon into position, and given the strong initial sales of Switch 2, they probably felt that they didn't need to do too much more, as at the time, their immediate anxiety was less how to incentivize more sales, but how to avoid massive shortages, which, as of November, were still an issue, particularly for Japanese retailers. Now, of course, it's just a theory and there's no way to know for sure, although perhaps the developer interviews for Splatoon Raiders will give us more insight. If we follow this logic through, why might Raiders have been delayed like this? There are many possible reasons. Maybe it got too big. As a Nintendo Switch 2 edition, it effectively had its potential sales capped at $20 worth of content. As a standalone game, the ceiling is obviously a lot higher, and it may have helped Nintendo to have a significant entry in one of their top franchises in the launch window of the Switch 2, given both their intention to promote their major franchises, see also Donkey Kong, Kirby and Metroid, and their wish to have high-profile games to convert Switch players to Switch 2 owners. It's also possible this was a response to Splatoon 4's development. I think there is probably an awareness that Nintendo need to show that the Switch 2 is providing a substantial evolution of their core franchises. Are some of the new features in Splatoon 3, such as Flow, or are things planned for Splatoon 4 that they decided to test out that much sooner? Was Raiders a mode for Splatoon 4 that they felt didn't quite fit, and they decided to split it off? An interesting point here will be to know exactly who is developing Splatoon Raiders. We know how Nintendo works in this regard. Even if their original prototypes are made by the core team, they have a recent form of bringing in other groups to take those prototypes to the finish line. Donkey Kong Bonanza had this arc. It seems strongly likely that Bowser's Fury also started out this way, with Nintendo software technology finally showing us Round Lake Lapcat. If Nintendo had a team they were working with, for example, the Bandai Namco studio in Singapore, who in November were confirmed as becoming a Nintendo wholly owned subsidiary, then they may have felt that they could hand off development of Raiders to an independent group while they got down to the serious business of working on Splatoon 4, with the project possibly into its second year by now, which, remember, was basically the entire gap between Splatoon and Splatoon 2. However, if Raiders is entirely internally developed with little evidence of anyone else besides the usual support studios, then I think it's reasonable to assume that Splatoon 4 would still be quite a long way off. One final consideration that might have put Nintendo off a Nintendo Switch 2 edition is the presence of the Side Order DLC, though. Releasing what would essentially be a second DLC set is something Nintendo rarely do. They sometimes have DLC in multiple waves, but I can only think of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate in recent times that has had two discrete sets of DLC, and even these were contiguous. It seems likely that another DLC set would harm the sales of Side Order. It's even possible, not likely but not completely unrealistic either, that Raiders was once conceived as DLC for Splatoon 3 but was spun off far earlier than we have supposed so far. For example, if they began development around Splatoon 3's release in September 2022, but by early 2023 realized that this game deserved its own title and a much fuller development, they could have pivoted to Side Order and delivered it within a year. Tight, but consistent with Octo expansion following 10.5 months after Splatoon 2's launch. Well, that means that if Nintendo were looking for developers to take the game on through the middle of 2023, whether a new internal group or an external studios, Raiders could actually have been in development concurrently with Side Order by the end of 2023, and perhaps the expectation was that, given the 2-year development period, it would actually be a launch window title for the Nintendo Switch 2. This would be another reason for the developers not to expect to need to upgrade Splatoon 3 too significantly. They just needed it to sell modestly off the back of Raiders hype and then follow up a year or two later with Splatoon 4. So, having laid out all of the possible options, ultimately it's for you to interpret which feels the more plausible. Personally, I think it's quite likely that Raiders was a prototype which earned the status of becoming a spin-off, but which could have been another mode or even a DLC. I also think the presence of a Splatoon-shaped hole in the first few months of Switch 2 probably motivated Nintendo's top team to request that the Splatoon developers made more out of Splatoon 3, especially given that this seems to be a fairly major strategy of the company at the moment. Whether this was because of the delays to Splatoon 4 or Splatoon Raiders, or because they dropped the idea of a Splatoon 3 full Nintendo Switch 2 edition, it feels quite impossible to say at this point, but hopefully more information will emerge from Nintendo over the coming years. One day I expect there will be a developer interview where we'll find out the full story, but in the meantime, do check out the Patreon for more early ad-free and exclusive content, like, hype and comment to help the channel, but even if you don't want to do any of that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.